a great group together. And let me, before each of them speak, I'll just say a couple of words of introduction for each. Hugh MacLeman is a special advisor at the British Red Cross and formerly, let me get this exactly right, Hugh, Director of Disaster Prevention and Risk Reduction at AusAid. And we'll be talking to us, I think, about the poverty dimensions of disaster risk. Hugh, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. In fact, I think my full title was Director of Disaster Prevention, Risk Reduction, Mine Action and Small Arms Control.
Wow.
Is a rather unwieldy portfolio. Thanks. I've been tasked today to talk about the relationship between disasters and poverty, which is obviously a less than straightforward dynamic. And so I will try to get through as much of that in the next 5 minutes as possible. So the first thing that I think we need to explore in talking about poverty and disasters is what is the actual link between poverty and disasters? Do we fully understand how these elements interact, and why does it matter? So maybe to talk about the second question first. How do I do this? Did you get to this one? Okay. To answer the second question first, I mean, it undoubtedly does matter. I mean, you heard just now some of the statistics and ODI's Future Framework Guide and today's paper. It makes the point that 325 million people will be living in the 49 most hazard-exposed countries by 2030. They're more likely to die, they're more likely to lose their livelihoods and their income, and it is an issue, and it's a growing issue. But I think there's a question as to whether we adequately understand how poverty and disasters interact, and I think it's often actually less straightforward than we assume. If you allow me a short digression maybe, certainly working with AusAid and previously I did a lot of work in the Pacific, and some of the communities in the Pacific are by any measure some of the poorest communities in the world, by income measure, by health measure, by education measure. They are hit by, on average, 2 cyclones a year, maybe a volcanic eruption every other year, multiple earthquakes, and by far and away they are the most resilient communities that I've ever worked with. They rebuild their houses very quickly, their staple crops are all underground, yet they are, by any measure, some of the poorest people in the world. Conversely, I mean, we think about future disasters, and we think about a massive technological failure in an urban area. Is that really likely to affect the poorest people, or is it likely to affect the middle poor the most? So I think we need to be careful about thinking about a linear and relationship between poverty and disasters. And I think when we generalize about the poor, we come up with less than satisfactory answers in terms of disaster risk reduction. I think there are important distinctions to be made between urban poor and rural poor. There are gendered differences when it comes to poverty, and also too there are very different impacts of disasters themselves: technological disasters, natural disasters, conflict, and other sorts of hazards. So I think when we're talking about poverty and disasters, it's maybe useful to think about 3 questions a bit more specifically. And one of those is what aspects of poverty are we talking about when we think about people's exposure to hazards and their vulnerability to disasters? Because I don't think we can generalize. I also think we need to think more about how poverty affects people's risk behavior. And I'm sure many of you have, for instance, visited the Kathmandu Valley, where poor people are more likely to accumulate disaster risk than those who are at a higher socioeconomic level, if you like. They will put an extra story on their house, which undoubtedly will fall down when there's an earthquake. And thirdly, I think we need to think about how disasters impact upon poverty levels. And what I mean by that is there a linear relationship between disaster reduction and poverty reduction? And I would suggest that there's not necessarily, and the dynamic between poverty and disasters is quite a complex one. So what I would say is that none of these issues are particularly well dealt with in the post-2015 disaster framework. They're not dealt with in any of the frameworks that are coming up in the next few years. They're not dealt with particularly well in the Sustainable Development Goals. They're not dealt with adequately yet in the World Humanitarian Summit, but in particular in the post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction. Poverty is almost not dealt with at all. I think Tom mentioned earlier when we were having a discussion before this, it's mentioned 4 times in the whole framework. And even with those 4 references, none of them, well, not all of them are actually talking about them in terms of the relationship to disasters. So it's almost absent in this framework. None of the priorities explicitly address poverty in terms of the way in which different aspects of poverty expose people to disaster risks. It doesn't look at the impact that people who are living in poverty have on risk accumulation. Nor does it think about the way in which disaster risk can actually impact upon poverty. While the specific needs of vulnerable countries is mentioned, such as small island states or landlocked countries, the Zero draft doesn't actually talk about poverty and people when it comes to disasters. It tends to talk about poverty and countries. And many others, when they've looked at this Zero draft, have also pointed this out. You've had the IFRC, the World Bank, GNDR, the UN System Review, and they've all pointed out that at the moment this framework actually doesn't adequately address poverty and disasters. The World Bank in particular looks at this issue around the way in which disaster risk is addressed, and it talks about resilience actually not necessarily being aligned with poverty reduction. Resilience, almost by definition, can reinforce existing socio-economic relations. And they in particular suggest that the way in which disaster risk is dealt with should look more at preventing new risks and reducing existing risks, rather than some of the emphases within the disaster risk reduction framework around resilience. And I think that's probably something that needs to be thought of more. The World Humanitarian Summit, while it's still at an early stage, also doesn't particularly link poverty and risk. That said, it does go further than the post-2015 framework on DRR. It does reference, for instance, that there are increasing numbers of poor people living in hazard-prone environments. And it also does start to look at disasters in terms of multiple risk contexts, and it differentiates the impacts of different sorts of disasters on the urban poor. So there is some progression, I guess, from the zero draft framework that we have for the post-2015 DRR framework. The Open Working Group proposals for the Sustainable Development Goals are probably better than all of these frameworks that are emerging that try to incorporate poverty and disasters. And what I mean by that is that when you look at the proposed Sustainable Development Goals, it is a real strength, I think, the way in which poverty is used as a lens to think about disasters within the Sustainable Development Goals. And they also segregate poverty within sectoral areas. And I think that really helps to unpack this concept of poverty and make sure that we're not thinking of it as a monolithic sort of term, and the way in which it is dealt with, I would suggest, within the post-2015 DRR framework. Am I up to the right slides? Yeah. So what are some of the gaps and the opportunities when it comes to the post-2015 framework for DRR? I think certainly there needs to be a much stronger focus on context-specific and differentiated needs. And this does need to really start to develop a better understanding of what we mean by poverty, in terms of how different aspects of poverty drive different aspects of vulnerability, how poverty can contribute to the accumulation of risk, and how poverty can actually impact upon risk behaviours, and in fact can drive an increased exposure to hazards. And it needs to be based on a much better understanding of the context in which people live, and this needs to be integrated into data collection and decision making. Secondly, there needs to be an increased understanding of the interaction between disaster risk reduction and poverty risk reduction strategies. And this is going back to this point that the way in which we address disasters doesn't necessarily have a positive impact upon poverty. For instance, resilience approaches can exacerbate and entrench existing socioeconomic dynamics. So we need to think more about, when we're thinking about resilience, when we're thinking about disaster prevention, when we're thinking about risk reduction. And I think at the moment within the post-2015 DRR framework, a lot of these terms are conflated, and there's not enough granularity, if you like, between what we're talking about when we're approaching different disasters. And finally, I think an obvious point, and one that I think probably other people on the panel will make, is that we do need to look at how we get greater coherence between the 2015 framework for disaster risk reduction and the other mechanisms that we have, including the Sustainable Development Goals and the World Humanitarian Summit. And in particular, I'd suggest that we need to take some of the approaches within the Sustainable Development Goals, like looking at poverty from a sectoral perspective, and start to think about that and integrate that much more strongly within the 2015 framework for disaster risk reduction. Thank you.
Hugh, thank you very much. Just a slight change in the order here. I think we've, at the moment, got a good connection with our speakers from overseas. So I'm going to move to Annie Patry, who is working currently in India with Handicap International, working on a inclusive... there's Annie, project coordinator for a project looking at inclusion and disaster risk reduction.